thank you again for inviting us to share some perspectives on the use of clinical practice data. I'll start out with just a quick introduction of who we are, as we are guests on this land. So I would like to take some time to honor the first residents of this land and let you know that I am presenting from the region of Peel, which is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. For thousands of years, Indigenous peoples have inhabited and cared for this land. In particular, I acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Ojibwe Chippewa peoples, the land that is home to the Métis, and most recently, the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. And I'll just let you know also that I identify as an immigrant female of Asian descent, and my preferred pronouns are she and her. And I'll invite Sean to add anything that he wants to this introduction.
No, thanks, Sandra. I think that my acknowledgement is very important. My name's Sean. I'm French-Canadian male. I identify as he and him.
So here are the objectives that we outlined in our abstract for this conference. And it was initially considered a workshop, but we're going to really simplify that. Please share questions if you have them in the chat. But our goals today are very minimal to help you identify a benefit of providing practice data reports, or maybe creating a system whereby clinical practice data, audit, and feedback processes are initiated within your context. And hopefully you can identify a way to translate those strategies to your workplace. So let's just define what we mean by clinical practice data. Audit and feedback is another term that's used to refer to some of these strategies. Audit and feedback processes are widely used to improve professional practice, either on its own or as a component of multifaceted quality improvement interventions. In an audit and feedback process, an individual's professional practice or performance is measured and then compared to professional standards or targets. In other words, their professional performance is audited. And even as I read those words, the question there of why is this contentious comes to mind, because I can imagine some initial resistance to being audited when you've spent years practicing your profession and are now working independently. We can dive into some of that, and Sean can perhaps also share some of his experiences later on. But the goal is that the results of this audit, of these comparisons, are fed back to the individual with the ultimate aim that they're encouraged to change their behavior, change the way that they work so that they are consistent with professional standards. So to make it explicit, why might a process like this be contentious? I'll group them as perhaps two main reasons, and I'll propose that one has to do with more system and cultural limitations, and the second has to do with maybe just general psychology of feedback and behavioral change. So in relation to system and cultural limitations, cognitive science has provided theory, methods, and findings for understanding clinical knowledge, problem solving, decision-making, and other cognitive phenomena in healthcare. But it has done so in a way that takes the individual practitioner as the relevant unit of cognitive analysis. And our healthcare system is far more complex than that right now. And we haven't really kept up with modifying our models and our approaches to capturing data that is complex and takes all of that into account. Our healthcare systems have largely inherited this approach of focusing on the individual in its teaching, the research, and the way we've designed the workplace and tried to integrate technologies. In terms of the area of psychology around getting feedback and resistance to change, this diagram here, taken from a study that Sean and Teresa Chan contributed to, really simplifies down in a one picture the major challenges that clinicians might have with accepting practice data. So what you'll see is that on the x-axis, There are considerations around their personal mindset around learning, self-development, lifelong learning, all of those characteristics. And then on the y-axis, there's also factors related to the validity or the perceived quality of the data that they're receiving. And so at different points, individual clinicians will resist this feedback if they feel that the report that they're getting is biased, or sourced from poor quality data, or is invalid because their values may even disagree with what they're seeing in the report, or their own values may disagree with the professional standards that they are being compared against. I'll pause and invite Sean to maybe expand on this, since he's an author on this study.
No, Sandra, I think that pretty much captures it, right? We were very mindful. One of the big things that came out of our qualitative work was that doctors, their first reaction is to be very skeptical of the data, and quite appropriately so, as we would be in any time that we were being measured or quantified in any way. And so the first part of this work truthfully is to spend a lot of time deriving and deriving systems that are honest to practice and capture some element of nuance that are as close to perfect as is reasonable to get there, actually.
I'll jump in and pick up on that thread, because it's possible to create systemic supports, I suppose. So, additional factors that might create resistance to change or resistance to feedback is when the feedback has some implications for what's required to change at the organizational level, right? So imagine an individual clinician that's getting feedback that really means, well, they have to change the whole system of how medications are managed, or the whole system within the hospital. That's really overwhelming for them to consider. Or imagine they get individual feedback that really has implications for the larger system and clinical routines.
Mm-hmm.
And so here's a diagram taken from another study that looked into what kinds of supports facilitate a feedback and audit cycle. And as you can imagine, just getting the culture to accept, one, that there would be some goal setting exercises, getting your own context to accept that feedback has a place, that they need time to interact with others, discuss and reflect. There's a lot of steps here, so it's really not as simple as sort of just starting to hand out report cards. You really need to work with your local setting, with your colleagues, and create a feedback cycle loop that everyone feels like that they own. Did you want to add anything here, Sean?
I think the first step is to get it out there and to start socializing this idea of having data that reflects your practice to some degree, having those early discussions around the value of this data and how important it is, allowing for the discussion to happen that there's no one perfect data metric, or even two or three, that's going to appropriately give you the nuance you need to have insights about your practice. And accepting that, if we're going to do this in a meaningful way, it requires quite expansive data measurement explicitly in a different set of fields that measure different aspects of practice, so that folks feel like they're seen in all of their practice, and that it doesn't cater to only the fast doctors, or only the doctors that spend a lot of time with patients, or only the doctors that do one specific thing well. And so having that family, spending time, gathering and thinking and coming to consensus on what that data looks like is a super important part of socializing this in the subsequent steps.
Some studies have already confirmed that the audit and feedback data are much more acceptable when it's timely, when it's seen to be based on sound evidence, when it's specific to that individual, when it's compatible with their sense of clinical practice autonomy, and fits with their understanding of patient expectations. And so I've just sort of simplified some of those enabling attributes, which are described in work by Sean and others, around creating a self-improvement culture, helping clinicians build capacity for reflection, self-assessment, and growth, and then just creating this sense of community around how this data is managed. And so arguably audit and feedback and the use of clinical practice data can create some of these benefits in that you could link it to customized coaching. You can follow long-term trends in system and individual performance. And really, you're focusing on ongoing quality improvement and patient safety initiatives. So I'm going to hand it over to Sean to kind of build on that and maybe help explore some concrete examples.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the audit and feedback environment, as Sanders pointed out, has this ability to kind of have us reflect on our own practice in ways that we didn't think were possible. It allows us to look at our own practice data relative to where we are within our peer group and say, oh my goodness, I'm here or I'm there or I don't know why, and at least ask questions that we may never otherwise do. And the truth is that we as practitioners do not often practice as teams to understand each other's performance to improve. The truth is that we practice in the same environment as individual practitioners. And in order for us to have insights about where we sit and where we stand and how we practice, we need to have this quantifiable mechanism. So the interesting part, and as you'll see in front of you, this is kind of an example of what our local dashboard looks like. And this is truncated just because the screen kind of rolls and rolls, and I think we have about 12 to 16 data points at present. But you can see on something like this where, you know, that the plus, the blue plus is where I would sit among a peer group, and you can see kind of the peer distribution across the entire spectrum. And so this is the very simplest version, what I would call the minimum viable product of what this looks like. But the next versions look a lot like, you know, what does the distribution of this group versus another group look like? I practice this in a similar academic environment. What are the learnings that then come from comparing one group to another based on their patient population, based on their clinical context, based on their background? And so that then really becomes important. And then interesting questions come out in the sense from individual practice as well as been like, okay, well, this is great. Like I'm a fast clinician and I don't order a lot of resources and everything is great. But what about how patients experience my care? And how do I then start capturing things that are actually important to the health system, to me and to patients, that's not really being, you know, captured in a real way? And then if you bring this now, you know, 10 years down the line, we have a series of 20 or 30 metrics that every physician is being constantly like provided feedback on. The question is, one, how do you have that person consume that? That becomes like a cockpit in an aircraft where all of these dials and monitors are there, and you could never possibly keep an eye on everything. So then you have to build in some intelligence, some AI, some machine learning that actually notifies clinicians when practice patterns are changing, when there's signal for moving forward, when there's ideas about, you know, we've seen improvement with other clinicians with these types of changes in these areas. Maybe you want to look at that. And the wealth of that data becomes more and more powerful and informative and allows people to really introspect in a meaningful way. In its ultimate permutation, you can actually see an AI, you know, combing through the background here, identifying practice patterns that become different and may in fact cue individuals in that person's circle on whether that individual needs a reach out or a touch base or how are you doing, or is there something going on in your life, or, you know, opens up a new practice pattern that would be very different for them in a very positive way and allows them to be congratulated for that. These are some of the augmented examples that are not as far ahead as this AI machine learning kind of approach. But, you know, looking at peer-to-peer discussions and moving forward around, you know, reacting to data, looking at the content and doing explicit coaching in specific areas from a peer-to-peer perspective, which is very unique and very different than what actually happens in most clinical specialties. And then this kind of audit and feedback framework of how they kind of socially constructed an environment where the discussion of peer data is very accepted and very welcome, and is actually demonstrated to prove movement in practice in a positive direction. And so these are all things we're starting to really consider and dive into, but they all start with the development of some element of practice measurement.
Well, that wraps up our introduction to these clinical practice data and some of the benefits. And hopefully so you've started to envision how you can make use of that.